In this module, I want us to accomplish three things. I'm going to have them written here. First, I'd like us to have an understanding of Darwin's theory of evolution, just very basically. Secondly, I'd like us to have an understanding as to how this theory represented a major break from all previous conceptions of human nature, at least in the West. And thirdly, I'd like us to have an appreciation for the debate about the scope of Darwin's theory. So in this video, I want us to focus on the first two, on these guys, and in the second video, I'll discuss the third issue. Now, I'm sure you all have some familiarity with Darwin's theory of evolution, but I think the basic tenets of the theory are laid out on page 14. So let's scroll over here and take a look at page 14, the summary of Darwinian evolution. Let's go through each of these points quite quickly. First of all, the first big point to take into consideration is that all organisms tend to produce more offspring than can possibly survive. So this is one of the premises that Darwin's working with. Secondly, offspring vary amongst themselves and are not carbon copies of an immutable type. So, right, all of our kids look different from one another. Thirdly, at least some of this variation is passed down by inheritance to future generations, which is why some of our kids, our grandkids, look like certain grandparents and others look like other grandparents. And fourthly, if many offspring must die, right, and this has to be the case because they can't all be accommodated in nature's limited ecology. If many offspring must die and individuals in all species vary among themselves, then on average, survivors will tend to be those individuals with variations that are fortuitously best suited to changing local environments. Since heredity exists, the offspring of survivors will tend to resemble their successful parents. The accumulation of these favorable variants through time will produce evolutionary change. Okay, so how does this theory, sort of encapsulated in these 4 points, how does this theory of evolution represent a major break from all previous conceptions of human nature? The way Richards puts it is that the idea of evolution by natural selection threatens to break down the distinction between mind and matter, right? So we have mind and we have matter, and this is importantly a distinction that was in a worldview before Darwin that's become under attack with his theory of evolution. So I've got some pictures here to keep us in mind as we're discussing this old theory. So Richards also nicely points out on page 16 why this classical and Christian worldview was so plausible, how it jived with common sense. The movements of the material world on this classical view have to be explained in terms of mind. So, matter, she says, can transmit motion to other matter, but it can, as it were, only pass on what it has received. It cannot initiate motion from rest or design itself from complex structures. The only beings capable of doing this are ones with minds like us. So when we're not thinking about how the world works, right, why rocks fall and why people do the things they do, and how the world is in action in the way it is as you observe it on National Geographic, the thought is that mind must somehow be behind it. And this notion of mind and reason explaining the movements of the physical world was already in Plato, Aristotle, and the idea runs through our course all the way up to Descartes. So Plato, for example, in the dialogue of the Timaeus, speaks of the divine demiurge, who's like a kind of craftsman, who built the cosmos according to his own reason. And Aristotle thinks that the movements of the cosmos have to be explained by what he named a first mover, which he deduced to be reason itself. This prime mover was reason itself. And actually, in On the Soul, which was a text that we read earlier, there's a controversial passage which we didn't read, where Aristotle even seems to suggest that the human mind is separable from the body. And Descartes, as we saw just last module, posited that our minds and the mind of God were substances distinct from the physical world. In the sixth meditation, which we didn't read, Descartes aims for what he says to prove that the mind is really, really, truly distinct from the body as a distinct substance. And this, of course, allowed for the mind to be separated from the body after death. That was a big thing for Descartes to prove. In any case, this worldview in which mind explained phenomena in the physical world, and you can see a few of those depictions here, right? These are some of those celestial spheres that Richards talks about in the text. This idea that mind has to explain phenomena in the physical world, the material world, lasted for 2 millennia. So what about Darwin's theory put this worldview, at least potentially, into doubt? And here Richards is really good. Scroll over to her answer as to um, why Darwin put this all put a big question mark on all this. This is on page 16 to 17. She writes, "It was this direction of explanation, from the higher to the lower, that Darwin's idea began to upset." Remember, higher, like mind, was used to explain the lower things, the more material things. Okay, and he did not, and Darwin, she says, did not venture, at least in public, beyond this limited territory. His theory did not extend to the development of life from inanimate matter, and he did not venture directly onto theological ground. But it was startling nevertheless, because he proposed a mechanism by which mindless processes might produce the kind of complexity that had previously seemed explicable only in terms of the intentions and power of what John Locke called a cogitative being, in this case God for Locke. Darwin explained organic complexity as something that just happened over vast periods of time, when simple creatures with no aspirations at all, right, so no mind at all, influenced by nothing but unconscious natural forces, reproduced more of their kind than could survive. Here's the crucial point. Darwin's direction of explanation was from bottom upwards rather than from top downwards. It began to explain the more powerful in terms of the less powerful. Now, this of course begins to call into question the role of mind, and especially God's mind, in explaining the processes of the biological world. In the next video, we'll map out the spectrum of views one might have about the scope of Darwin's theory on evolution, and how, to what extent we can think of minds as really being explained by these lower, more material things.